Honestly, I'm really torn about making this video because I just know so many Christians who don't approve of really any kind of horror. In fact, I bet a lot of Christians might even disagree with a lot of the takes I'm going to make in this video. But as a devoted Christian, I think the relationship between Christianity and horror, especially in the context of video games, is a topic that doesn't get nearly enough attention or analysis, and I think there's a goldmine of truly fascinating insights and life lessons that are really only possible to experience when you choose to take a closer look at horror and what it really means when you use it as a guiding factor for your decisions, your emotions, and even your lifestyle. It doesn't matter if you're a believer like me or an atheist or from another religion altogether. I think everyone can learn from this topic. So, without further ado, here's why I love horror games, even though I'm a Christian. Now, the first thing I need to clarify about this topic is this. Most Christians don't like horror. Growing up as a serious, dedicated Christian, I think I can count the number of other Christians I knew who liked anything horror-related on one hand. Honestly, I never liked horror. I was pretty much scared of the dark until I was 19 freaking years old. The few times I actually watched a scary movie, the images and scenes of these movie monsters got burned in my brain, and I'd have trouble sleeping for weeks, thinking they were gonna jump out of the closet and murder me in my sleep. It seemed like all my non-Christian friends weren't bothered by any of this kind of stuff, while all my Christian friends were either as scared as me or just didn't approve of anything horror-related at all. And that was pretty much my whole perspective on horror in general for my whole life. Like a lot of Christians, I thought just about anything horror-related wasn't a good thing to consume until I reached my 30s. In my 30s, something completely unexpected happened. I got absolutely addicted to horror video games. Like real horror games. The exact kind of games that so many of my Christian friends and family had been disapproving of my entire life. After playing and beating games like 3 different Dead Space games, Resident Evil 2 and 4 and 7 and 8 and Outlast and Silent Hill 2, I started to realize why so many Christians and religious people mistakenly hate some parts of the horror genre, and how in so many of these games there were actually profound and powerful themes of courage, the power of light over darkness, humanity's capacity for evil but also for good, and how the monsters we face are often the very keys to our own enlightenment and transformation. I now think that the horror genre can be such a fun, fascinating, and yes, even edifying experience for those brave enough to look into the deep abyss of our souls and see what might be looking back at us in the darkness. You've probably heard the stories of Christians and religious people who have gone a bit overboard with their dislike, even hatred, of anything horror-related. Case in point, my own aunt, among countless other Christian moms, forbade my cousins from even reading the Harry Potter books growing up because they involved magic and the occult. I had several Christian friends whose parents forbade them from celebrating Halloween, even banning Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh cards in their house because some of the creature cards were of demons and whatnot. And while I really disagree with most of this mindset and think it's mostly ridiculous fear-based nonsense, there's something you need to understand about the Christian belief system. For us, the devil is real. Hell is a real place. Demons are real. Demonic possession is real. The Bible, something Christians take as a largely literal document, is riddled with stories so horrifying that they make most modern horror flicks look pretty tame in comparison. In Luke chapter 8, there is a story of the demoniac, a demon-possessed man who confronts Jesus and his followers. When Jesus had stepped out on land, there met him a man from the city who had demons. For a long time he had worn no clothes, and he had not lived in a house, but among the tombs. Jesus asked the man's name. "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." I mean, come on, that's like straight out of a horror movie, right? In the book of Jonah, a man gets eaten alive by a gigantic fish and spends days in the pitch black darkness of the animal's digestive system, waiting to die a slow and painful death all alone with no way out. In Genesis 19, Lot's wife broke God's command by looking back to witness his destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and God punished her by literally turning her into a pillar of salt before her family's very eyes. If you take a few seconds to look up biblically accurate angels, you'll see some absolute nightmare fuel-looking beings that can resemble monsters out of a scary movie much more than nice angelic babies with wings. The Bible is not rated PG. There's actually a lot more horror-type imagery and themes in it than you might expect. There are magicians and sorcerers in the Bible with actual powers who could levitate, turn water into blood, and even create plagues. Christians believe that there are real forces of good and evil behind the veil of our vision here on earth. And the Bible makes it clear that God forbids Christians from entertaining any affection for things like the occult, witchcraft, or magic. Essentially, any power other than God himself. On the other hand, the book of Philippians encourages Christians to keep your minds on whatever is true, pure, right, holy, friendly, and proper. Don't ever stop thinking about what is truly worthwhile and worthy of praise. It can be pretty hard to try and attribute any of those words to horror video games or the genre in general. Many horror games are inherently desensitizing, spraying blood and guts and body parts in every other enemy encounter, and the Bible tells Christians that we need to keep our empathy strong for those suffering and in need, battling real-life afflictions. So, while I think it's pretty ridiculous that some Christian parents prohibit their children from playing Magic the Gathering because some cards feature like devils and demons and whatnot, perhaps you can see why some overzealous Christians can get so wrapped up in avoiding anything horror-related. Still, I need to clarify. When I say I love most horror games, the ones I really don't mess with are the demon-focused ones. I, along with every other Christian, believe demons are real and can have power over you if you give it to them. It's not that I'm afraid of demons, and thanks to Jesus, I don't have to be, but it's that I want to be careful with what I consume in my games, TV, books, and movies, because the Bible is pretty clear on that point. But I've come to love other kinds of horror. As a Christian who never played horror games, I was surprised to find myself really connecting with horror game protagonists like Leon Kennedy from Resident Evil or Isaac Clarke from Dead Space on a much deeper level than I usually do with horror game protagonists. Something about protagonists like Jill Valentine or Alan Wake or Ethan Winters and their struggle against truly terrifying monsters and obscenely difficult challenges, and watching them do their best to make the most out of a really bad situation with a few bullets and smoke grenades they had at their disposal was really inspiring to me. I would turn off my console after a particularly difficult level and just feel affection for these characters who had to deal with so much shit, and in a silly way, feel that if they could overcome their crazy situation, maybe I could overcome some of my own real-life struggles too. These are the horror games I love and recommend to anyone who asks, Christian or not. Because even though most Christians aren't fans of horror, there are lots of horror games out there that can actually help you feel stronger, more courageous, and more resilient in the crazy real world that you and I have to deal with every single day, with monsters far more terrifying than anything you'll find at the Umbrella Corporation. These games can help you recognize good from evil, right and wrong, and see the consequences of your actions in the face of temptation, danger, or cowardice. Again, let me be clear. I don't like all horror games. Of course, there are countless bad games out there that just suck, with bad and boring gameplay, cheap jump-scare tactics, and underbaked themes that lack any meaningful substance. But there are lots of highly rated and popular horror games I also don't like because, in my opinion, they're missing one key horror element for me. They're not edifying. Edification, experiencing moral or intellectual improvement, and horror games might seem like opposites, and many times they are. But in my experience, some of the most impactful and memorable horror experiences were from games and movies that meant something. Pyramid Head from Silent Hill 2 is a really cool looking monster and all, but it's what he represents that has made him an absolute icon of horror games to this day, despite the game being released over 20 years ago. The personification of protagonist James Sunderland's undying, unstoppable guilt for his sins. Five Nights at Freddy's may have started out as a pretty basic jump scare simulator, But one of the reasons Freddy Fazbear has become such a global horror game icon is because those games mean something. What with their endless mountains of interconnected lore and Easter eggs, where half the fun is finding these clues and piecing theories together to discover objective truths among the gameplay that you can discuss with your friends for months after you roll the credits. Even some of the most popular elevated horror movies in the last decade aren't just about scary monsters that are trying to kill you for no reason. Hereditary is a study on the consequences of unresolved dysfunctional family abuse. In The Babadook, grief is the real monster. For me, pieces of horror media like this go far beyond the simple jump scares and scary monsters. They leave me thinking about their meaning for weeks, even months after viewing them. I usually feel more clarity about my own choices and mistakes and how I could be better in the future. Now, not every horror game is like this. There are plenty of horror games that have no interest in being anything other than cheap schlock. Games that are a dime a dozen in the genre who rely on grotesque brutality to disgust audiences. I think the best example of this point is from the Terrifier franchise. From what I've heard, because I haven't seen them and I have no interest in doing so, the sole point of those movies is to present the most outlandishly disgusting, senselessly violent extremes of horror just for the sake of doing so. It's the lazy cash grab angle to shock audiences with empty, grotesque violence in lieu of actual substance or meaning. And look, if you're into that sort of thing, I'm not here to criticize you, but those aren't the kind of horror experiences I'm interested in at all. Lots of horror games are like this too, and there's a market for it. Think Manhunt or Postal 2. These kind of games are the generic cheeseburgers of the genre. The most empty calorie and insubstantial slop that's just meant to gross you out to the extreme, nothing more. But I was surprised to realize that many horror games and horror media in general have powerful messages behind them and provide insightful commentary on real-world problems. Let's take Leon Kennedy, for instance. First appearing in the game Resident Evil 2, Leon has become one of the most recognizable and popular protagonists in the entire Resident Evil franchise, and even in the horror genre as a whole. He could have easily been this one-note, one-dimensional, zombie-killing military shooter like so many others we've seen and forgotten by now, but he wasn't. Leon was a badass zombie killer, yes, but he was also goofy, cheeky, plucky, fearless in the face of danger, and always got back up when he got his ass kicked, which actually happened kind of a lot. He wasn't fighting for himself to look good, he was fighting for his friends, on behalf of humanity, to do the right thing. In Resident Evil 2, dude has the worst ever first day on the job as he starts his police career the day of the Raccoon City outbreak. He's unsure of himself, but wants to do the right thing and save as many people as possible, putting himself in danger and risking his life for people he hasn't even met. One of the most surprising parts about Resident Evil 4 was the fact that the developers didn't pair Leon and Ashley together at the end. He rejects her. In a sea of predictable tropes and character arcs, Leon subverted the whole badass zombie hunter dude and isn't just some one-note action hero who gets the girl and rides off into the sunset on a horse. He actually rides on a speedboat. But not having Leon end up with Ashley was a twist of expectations on the well-mined trope of zombie horror, and I really appreciate that about his character. He has an unwavering sense of duty and compassion, and Leon is wonderfully rounded out with his roundhouse kicks, snappy one-liners, and the conviction to keep going no matter what unstoppable juggernaut zombie is stalking him. Even though the Resident Evil games Leon is a part of are violent, dark, and terrifying, Leon is a beacon of light that we players can look to throughout the game, even in his darkest moments. He's funny, always keeping the darkness at bay with a well-timed eye roll or ridiculous pun. All the time I spent with Leon in the several Resident Evil titles he's featured in were just an excellent time. Not to mention, the Resident Evil games are just incredible overall, and I often left my play sessions wired from crazy zombie fights, but also happy and thrilled, upbeat, and jovial from spending hours watching this dude kick zombie ass. Or how about Isaac Clarke from Dead Space? I found his character, choices, and development very edifying throughout my time tiptoeing through the USG Shimura and beyond. Isaac is someone I would follow into battle. Dude is awesome, and not just because he's one of the most badass alien killers in history. In addition to his traditionally masculine bravado, he also overtly respects women. He's resourceful, he's honest about his many shortcomings, he's absolutely motivated to survive, he's selfless, he's single-minded, he's weak but owns his mistakes, he calls out bullshit and wickedness, he constantly risks his life for others. Now look, try telling the Christian Moms Book Club that Dead Space is a great game for Christians, right? I get it, it's a hard sell, and I bet there are a lot of smart Christians out there who might even try and correct my opinion here and tell me that all the terrifying body horror, the over-the-top violence, and the nightmarish necromorphs in Dead Space aren't good for a Christian to consume and appreciate. But honestly, I just disagree. I just think that there's so much you can learn from playing these games, so many opportunities to better yourself, and watch how a seemingly impossibly strong power of evil can still be overcome by the tiniest beacon of light. Of course, this is all particular taste, and if a Christian is into that, I totally get it. All good. Honestly, I myself was surprised that I loved Dead Space so much. And it's a weird thing to say that Dead Space can be an edifying piece of media in a spiritual sense. Of course, in this game, there's this crazy religious cult, and it has a whole angle of like calling out heresy and manipulative church leaders, but that's not even the point. My point is that Isaac Clarke is an excellent protagonist who isn't simply a medium to glorify evil or showcase violence. He's as against necromorphs as we are, and he bravely defies them at every turn. He constantly places himself in harm's way to save others. Dead Space does glorify violence in lots of ways, don't get me wrong, but the way I understood it, it was a showcase of humanity's capacity for good in the face of terrifying violence and danger. Turn the game off and there's no shortage of evil and wickedness in the world that requires us to be just as brave and single-minded and fearless as Isaac Clarke is. Honestly, Isaac inspired me to be better, and I found the Dead Space games to be supremely edifying in that regard. The Bible has countless stories of men and women committing terrible crime against each other. Brothers kill brothers, kings enslave subjects, families choose money over their loved ones. As it says in Romans, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. In Psalms it says, none is righteous, no, not one. As Christians, we believe we were born into a world of sin, and our own sinful desires separate us from God and lead us to committing terrible things to each other in our search for power, wealth, fame, control, and prestige. Horror games often feature antagonists and villains that are manifestations of these desires. As much as lots of Christians lament how wicked the world is, they too have the same desires buried deep within their soul. Horror games remind us of this and give us an opportunity to see what might happen if we did follow through on those desires and the dangers and consequences of doing so. Humans have great capacity for evil, and it's something that most people would rather not think about. It's just easier to say that the murderer, the torturer, the thief, and the liar are just bad people, not like us. It's comforting to tell yourself that even though you could be bad sometimes and tell lies and be deceitful and arrogant and selfish, you wouldn't kill anybody. You wouldn't steal your friend's money. You wouldn't abuse anyone, right? Horror games remind us of the uncomfortable truth that yes, we could, and we do. It's a really important lesson that I never heard in any Sunday school sermon growing up. If I'm not careful, I can be a really bad guy. But I also have the choice to make sure that doesn't happen if I work hard for it. No man knows how bad he is until he has tried very hard to be good, wrote the great Christian theologian C.S. Lewis. Only those who try and resist temptation know how strong it is. A man who gives in to temptation after 5 minutes simply doesn't know what it would have been like an hour later. That is why bad people, in one sense, know very little about badness. They have lived a sheltered life by always giving in. We never find out the strength of the evil impulse inside us until we try and fight it. And Christ, because he was the only man who never yielded to temptation, is also the only man who knows to the full what temptation means the only complete realist. Christ knows what we are capable of, good and bad. And something I find just absolutely beautiful and sobering and undeniable about horror games is that they show humanity's capacity and potential for evil, and how easy it can be to make small decisions over and over until you look up and realize you become a true villain, an agent of evil in the world. Horror games also show us what it takes to defeat this evil, and the depth of courage, skill, and resilience it requires to do it. A popular horror game mechanic that I absolutely love is the potential for different endings based on your decisions in the game. While most other games are mostly linear and typically only have one actual ending to the story, your choices matter in horror games because depending on what you do, you could experience several potential outcomes for your actions or misdeeds. One of my favorite examples of this is in Silent Hill 2. The game is essentially monitoring your behavior throughout your entire playthrough, measuring and tracking even the most subtle decisions that you make. Do you quickly heal when you've taken damage and thereby exhibit a stronger will to live? Or do you allow yourself to walk around hurt and bleeding, ignoring your needs and demonstrating that you don't care about taking care of yourself? Do you protect Maria, or do you leave her to fend for herself? You can even impact the ending you get by actually pausing the game, clicking over to your dead wife's photograph, and viewing it, showing the game that playing as James Sunderland, you genuinely care for her and are showing yourself to be a dedicated and devoted husband. The game watches all this, it's crazy. What you do in real life matters a lot too, obviously. Every little choice you make can have potentially enormous consequences, both the choice to act or the choice to not. As Edmund Burke famously said, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Horror games remind me that my choices matter, both in the game and in real life, and I have direct impact over my life and lives of others, depending on the choices I make. In the words of horror researcher Reese Goodall, it has long been theorized that the horror genre should be read as a reflection of societal and cultural fears, allowing audiences to engage with the traumatic legacy of the recent past. If you take a look at the history of horror media in America, you may be surprised to see the level of depth and intentionality the makers of these pieces of horror put into their creations. Classic American horror movies of the 1950s, The Thing from Another World, Invaders from Mars, and Invasion of the Body Snatchers were a direct response and manifestation of widespread distrust and fear of evil things different than ourselves, as seen in the widespread distrust and suspicion the country had towards each other in the Red Scare and rampant McCarthyism. The 60s brought horror flicks like Psycho, Rosemary's Baby, and Night of the Living Dead, as our boogeyman shifted from being the monsters out there to the monsters living next door. In the words of Stephen King, ever since John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas, the great American boogeyman has been the guy with the rifle in a high place. Horror media in the 70s, like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween, and Last House on the Left, were a response to fears of real-world serial killers hunting down our innocent youth. The 80s brought horror classics like Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, and countless imitations warning teenagers that the ongoing revolution of sex, drugs, and rock and roll would lead to death. On and on, each decade of horror reflected real life, and our real fears we struggle with even after we left the movie theater. Now, horror games have followed a similar path. Today, we've had several remakes of classic beloved horror titles like Dead Space, Silent Hill 2, Clock Tower, several Resident Evils, Alone in the Dark, among many more. But I'm more interested in these games for the time when they were originally released. In the 90s and 2000s, at the peak of the Resident Evil franchise, there was rampant fear and confusion around biochemical warfare, viruses, and plagues. Anthrax, avian flu, SARS, Ebola, the swine flu are just a few examples of global viruses that ravaged countless countries and people across the globe. Resident Evil's through line of the T virus can be seen as a direct reflection of this kind of terrifying biological development that humanity wasn't prepared for. The Silent Hill series explored countless social psychological fears, specifically through the lens of being a woman, from stalking, unwanted advances, and assault during a time when violence towards women was rising. Doki Doki Literature Club was a scathing critique of the objectifying portrayal of women in anime for decades. BioShock and Dead Space explore the dangers of capitalism and corporate greed, reflecting the real-life culture of corporate greed that's been around for decades. Condemned and Outlast were games that demonstrated the evils of society's unchecked over-reliance on pharmaceutical and recreational drugs. The best horror games mean something and represent real-world societal fears. Better yet, they are also a way of processing this trauma and dread and literally guide us through our paralyzing fears into a place of closure and catharsis to the extent that they can. I still recommend everyone go to therapy and deal with their issues with a trained professional, but as someone who's gone to therapy for over 12 years now, I can't help but notice the feelings I get from completing horror games are, in a way, echoes of the progress I've made in therapy. I've had to learn how to confront my own demons, face my own fears, admit wrongdoing, and choose to be better. The only way out is through. And as silly as it might sound to compare that to like being a boss in Resident Evil, there's something about horror games that always remind me of the real life progress I've made over my own fears and faults. You and I have many fears. Some are unique to you, but others are far more universal. Fears that most people have struggled with sometime in their life. In my experience, horror games give you opportunities to wrestle and overcome some of our most common and shared fears as a species. The fear of the dark, of the unknown, the monster waiting to pounce on you just behind the door. From a purely marketing perspective, most horror games must tap into more universal fears because, well, a horror game about something as niche as glottophobia, the fear of balloons, or paganophobia, the fear of beards, just probably wouldn't sell a lot of copies to a large audience. But games about being chased by something at night, about being stranded alone in a strange and dangerous place, games about being trapped in a house with an evil presence hiding in the basement, these are things that you and I have probably had some real world dread about. I think a lot of Christians, often rightly, criticize many horror games for glorifying evil and making light of humanity's deepest fears. As Christians, we must shun evil, resist the devil, and strive to grow closer to God through purity and goodness. What purity and goodness could ever come from playing a game like Bendy and the Ink Machine, right? What sense of hope or catharsis can a chainsaw battle with Jack Baker and Resident Evil 7 give us? Actually, I think a lot. Horror games have the unique ability to help us experience and fight through real-world fears simulated and projected onto our screens. Throughout my experience playing through several Dead Space games, one thought kept repeating in my head over and over. The only way out is through. I would often find myself opening a door only to gaze into a massive, darkened murder labyrinth of a room where the only sound was a sinister scuttling, scraping of limbs on the floor, and otherworldly screeches of monsters no doubt lying in wait for me. There was no turning back, no way around, no cheat or hack or skip or any way for me to get through this obstacle. The only way out was through. I had to move forward through whatever was waiting for me in that room to make progress. This mimics life in obvious ways. You and I are constantly blocked by obstacles and challenges in our life. Lack of money, loneliness, depression, joblessness, the mistakes of our past, whatever. And a lot of people never really address these issues. They just ignore them, pretend they're not real, or do everything they can to go around them and not confront the truth. Or some people do choose to confront these problems and become better for it. Entering a new room in Dead Space started to feel more and more like entering a session with my therapist where I knew we'd be talking about some difficult subjects I would much rather avoid. But you can get through it if you have the bravery and steadfastness to look at your fear in the eye and face it head on. I play a lot of different types of video games. I've put over 1,000 hours into the fighting game genre alone. I love Metroidvanias, turn-based tactics, deck builders, RPGs, open worlds, linear games, pixel art platformers, and most everything between. But honestly, no game teaches me more about myself than horror games. As a Christian, there's a lot of horror-related media I don't like and I stay away from. But unlike the vast majority of my Christian brothers and sisters, I actually do see a lot of value in the horror genre, especially in horror games. I've been going to therapy for over 12 years now, and one thing I learned early on in therapy was that if I wanted to get better, I had to confront the ugliest things I'd ever done. I'd have to be brutally honest and go explore the darkest caves that I tucked away in the farthest corners of my mind. If I wanted to be free, I had to face my fears. I never really understood that that's also pretty much how horror games work. It's always been easy to compare how video games and work reflect life. If you want to beat the boss, you need to develop your skills and level up. You need to practice and grind and become better if you want to reach the next level. But horror games imitate life in a different, more intimate way. Horror games are usually not about leveling up in the traditional sense. You may get better equipment and better guns, but leveling up in horror games usually means that you, the player, need to become braver. It's like leveling up in real life. And it's only when you develop the poise to perform under pressure, to not panic when your flashlight dies in the darkness, when you need 3 headshots to escape but you only have 3 bullets left, when the boss ambushes you after you just used your last healing kit. In horror games, the only way out is through. In a way, horror games and the developers behind them truly care about their players enough to force them to become better, braver, and more poised than they were before. And I really appreciate that. There is no wasted time in horror games, not usually anyway. There is no grinding through mind-numbing, repetitive enemy encounters to learn a new ability. No microtransaction nonsense from companies that try and manipulate you into stumbling into their new monetization infrastructure, for the most case. In horror games, it's just you, the enemies, and your ability to stay cool under pressure. As a Christian, I never appreciated horror games before, but this combination of adrenaline rush, puzzle solving, world-class atmosphere, and some of the most haunting, creative, and terrifying monster designs that mankind has ever created got me so hooked on horror games that I really think this has become my most played video game genre. There's a lot more I can say about the relationship between Christianity and horror games and what horror games have meant to me as a Christian as an adult. Like how horror games are mostly about surviving, which is often how life can become sometimes. They make you face your demons, just like you have to do in real life to grow up and mature and be better. And they can give you the cathartic experience of facing some deep, crazy fears of yours and overcoming them, at least through a simulation. But this video's gone on too long already, so I'm going to save all that for a different video. Thanks for watching. And if you want to watch more videos like this, be sure to click that subscribe button. Thanks.